Remember when we talked about how it came to be that human beings, us, live on the earth? The universe came to be, the earth came to be, and when the earth was ready, human beings came. We also talked about the Phoenicians and how fortunate we are that they used such clever writing that we are still using for the alphabet today. We also talked about how people spoke to each other, probably some time before they needed to write anything down. However, we do not know how long ago it was that human beings first began to speak. We only know that they did. We can imagine that whenever people began to speak, they used words that meant numbers. People who lived a long time ago had the same need to talk about numbers that we do. Think about their daily lives. They needed to know how many animals they had to have in order to feed their tribe. They needed to know how big each of these animals had to be. And when they found a new cave, they had to decide if a cave was large enough for their group. When leaving for the hunt, they needed to know how much food to pack, and this depended on how far they had to travel. In fact, those who have studied the languages of many groups of people have never found a language that did not show the idea of a number. Some languages only use 1 or 2, and one language that said only to mean 1. It is very likely true that people, no matter when or where they lived, have some idea of a number. If the question, "How many deer did you see?" was asked, a person could answer by showing that number of fingers, or by making a particular group of sticks or stones. Perhaps when the deer were passing, some person made a notch on a stick for each one that passed by. Then, by looking at the stick, they would have their answer. No matter, people learned that some way of keeping count was necessary so that they could tell each other what had happened. We can be sure that people from the earliest times counted and thought of different ways to remember and show the count. It seems likely that people spoke for many years before they had a need to put things in writing. We already talked about the Phoenician traders from about 3000 BC who invented a very simple way of recording words. It is just as likely that people used words for numbers in speech and that they kept count with their fingers and sticks or stones long before they invented signs for particular numbers. This is the story I want to tell you today. When and where did people use the written marks that we use today for their numbers? 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians lived in a valley between two rivers. Their country was Mesopotamia. We have records from about 3000 BC that show that the Sumerians could read and write and had a way of writing numbers. Cuneiform was their way of writing wedge-shaped marks because they used a stick pressed into clay tablets that made wedge-shaped marks. There's another group of people, the Babylonians, who lived a little bit later than the Sumerians, but who also used the cuneiform writing. The Babylonians also lived in the same river valley and so continued to use this writing because clay was so plentiful. There are two reasons why we have these records of the number the way that the Babylonians wrote. The first is that they were merchants and traders, and so they wrote and stored many, many records. The second is that the part of the world where they lived was a hot, dry climate. The clay tablets used for these records dried brick hard in the hot sun, and they stayed dry and hard for many centuries. We also have records of number writing by people called the Egyptians, who lived about the same time as the Babylonians and who were also merchants and traders. Do you remember when we talked about their picture writing? The Egyptians also used pictures to write numbers, and one interesting thing about them is they had pictures for very large numbers, even 1,000,000. This symbol was a picture of a person with open arms. This represented an astonished person. You might say, "Wow," in similar circumstances. Perhaps they were successful in business. Now the Greeks, who lived a bit later, did something else. They used the first letters of the number words' names to represent their numbers. For example, the Greek word for 5 is penta, and so 5 was wrote as the Greek letter pi. The Romans also used some first letter symbols just as the Greeks, but they also invented other signs. For example, they wrote X for 10. Perhaps this sign came from the crossing of the thumbs of both of their hands. Notice how the crossed thumbs look like an X. The Roman way of writing numbers was the way that the merchants of Europe used until the 18th century. This is probably so because addition and subtraction are very easy with Roman numbers, and merchants really did not need to do anything more complicated. It is interesting to know that the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans wrote the symbol for the number 1 almost the same way that we write 1. Babylonians, 1 vertical mark in clay. Egyptians, vertical picture for the pointing finger. Greeks, a vertical line. Romans, a vertical line. Remember that this is a story about when and where the symbols that we write came to be. What about the rest of the symbols for number words, the numerals that we traced with the sandpaper numbers? The first records that match the way that we write our numerals were found in India, used by the people that we call the Hindu. The Hindus cut signs into the wall of a cave more than 2,000 years ago. 0 was not one of these signs. However, 1,000 years later, records from India show that Hindu had invented a sign for 0. The question is, how did these numerals get from India to us? We know that people from India traded from people from the lands called Arabia. The merchants who traveled from India brought their way of recording numbers with them. However, the people who lived in Arabia did not need a way to record numbers. They already had their own way, including a 0, so they did not need to use the Hindu way. Why would anyone change their ways if what they were using was working just fine? Nevertheless, an Arab scholar thought that the Hindu way was a clever way to write numbers, so he wrote a little book about this way, a book that found its way into Europe about 1,000 years ago. We know this because in a handwritten paper dated AD 976, European writing had these same signs. Since the book had brought these numerals to Europe and they came from Arabia, they were called the Arabic numerals. We have records to show that these curved Arabic numerals were copied by hand for many years in documents. However, merchants continued to use the Roman numerals because they were made with straight lines, and so there was less of a chance for mistakes. There was another reason to continue to use the Roman numerals that had no 0. Merchants used counting frames for addition and subtraction and therefore did not need a 0. 0 was just no beads on that wire of the counting frame. The use of 0 became necessary as records increased. How else could you tell someone that the 1 that you were writing meant 1,000 or 100 or 110 or just 1? With the invention of the printing press around AD 1450, there was a smaller chance of mistakes from handwriting. The 0 made it possible to write any number and know what the numerals meant. Therefore, the people of Europe began to use the Arabic numerals written almost the way that we write, and the numerals have not changed much since that date because of the printing press. So this is a story of how the way we write numerals came to us. You might think, as I do, that the Hindu-Arabic-European numerals is a good name.